What is up, everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of the Second Chair Leadership Podcast. Remember, second chair does not mean second best. Today, we are addressing the elephant in the room that's shaking the foundation of churches across America, and it's this right here, the trend of unfaithful church leaders. Yeah, I said it. We're talking about the moral failures that have shattered trust, hurt congregations, and strained the reputation of the church. But here's the deal. Second chair leaders, you are in the perfect position to stop this before it happens. You have the power to protect the integrity of your church. Here's a hard question for you today. What would you do if you found out that the person you've been serving under was living a double life? Would you be shocked? Would you be hurt? Would you be angry? Would you confront it? Or would you just sit back in silence, hoping someone else would step up? Because here's the reality. The crisis of unfaithfulness isn't just happening out of nowhere. It's happening on our watch. And if you're not taking action as a second chair leader, you're already part of the problem. So let me be clear. Let me be crystal clear. Churches don't fall because of a single moral failure. They fall because there was a lack of accountability long before the failure ever happened. So second chair leaders, it's time to step up and ask the hard questions and be the guardians of integrity. So let's get into it today. Let's kick this episode off by talking about what's happening in America's churches. If you've been paying attention, you've seen the headlines coming across the news station or the newspaper. Pastors caught in scandals, churches collapsing, congregations left in shock. You know, it feels like every freaking month there's another high-profile leader falling into moral failure. And here's the harsh truth. This problem right here didn't just show up overnight or out of nowhere. It's been brewing for years, and now we're seeing the full impact of leaders who've been living in the shadows. Listen, I'm not just pulling this out of the thin air today. Barna research shows that nearly 1 in 3 pastors admit to having had an inappropriate relationship, whether that be emotionally, physically, or even both. 1/3. I mean, think about that for a second. 1/3. What? We're not just talking about a few bad apples here. This is a systemic issue that's tearing churches apart. And guess what? It doesn't just stop there. Research from Pew indicates that people, especially millennials and Gen Z, are turning away from the church in droves. And one of the biggest reasons is this. You ready? It's hypocrisy in leadership. People don't trust pastors anymore. And quite honestly, I don't blame them. I don't trust pastors. You know, they see leaders preaching one thing and living something else, and they're just done with it. They're over it. When a leader falls, it's not just a scandal. It's a spiritual disaster. People are left questioning everything. You know, they say like things like this. If my pastor cannot live a godly life, then what's the point? How could I do it? That, you know, we feel betrayed, abandoned, and some of these people never, ever come back. Second chair leaders, this is where you come in. You have a front row seat to what's happening behind the scenes. It's your job to protect the integrity of your church before it's too late. Come on, let me know in the comments if you've ever been through anything like this before. I know it's a heavy subject, but the Bible, we all know, is crystal clear about the high standards for leaders. James chapter 3, verse 1 tells us, "Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach, we who preach will be judged more strictly." Leaders, we all know this. in the church, where we are not held to just human standards, we are held to God's standards. Say amen. And when they fall short, the consequences of them falling short are very devastating. But here's the thing. Leadership failure isn't a new problem. David, one of the greatest leaders in biblical history, fell into moral failure with, Bathsheba, right? In 2 Samuel, we read about that. But David didn't just wake up one morning and decide to commit adultery. It started with a small compromise. David should have been out on the field fighting with his men, right? But instead, he stayed back in the comfort and he stayed back in isolation. That's how it happens. It's a series of small compromises that build up until everything finally collapses. So what do? That's the question, right? How do we stop this cycle of failure? Second chair leaders, it's on you. You're not just there to take orders or make sure things run smoothly, because I know you're already taking care of that. You, my friends, are the gatekeepers of integrity in your church. You're the ones who can see the small compromises before they become catastrophic failures. You see what's happening behind closed doors and in those offices. You know what's up, but you need to start asking the hard questions. Push for transparency and be the accountability that's so desperately missing in today's churches. All right, let's talk about what I would say is probably one of the biggest traps that takes leaders down. You ready? It's PRIDE. It's pride. If there's one thing that has led to more moral failures than anything else, it's this. Leaders start believing their own hype. They get a taste of success. They start hearing the applause, and before long, they think they're untouchable. That's when everything starts going south. And some of you know what I'm talking about right now. All right, let's be real. Ego, my God, is the silent killer. And the thing about pride is that it doesn't show up all at once. It creeps in slowly. It's whispering in your ear, things like this. You got this. You are special. You don't need any advice. You don't need accountability. And before you know it, you have built this wall around yourself, and no one, and I mean no one, can get in. And that's when the enemy strikes. Like, look at what happened to Lucifer. He was the most beautiful. He was the most powerful angel, but pride led to his downfall. Pride led to his destruction. He thought he could be greater than God. And that arrogance cost him everything. The same thing happened to King Saul. You know the story. Saul was chosen by God, but his pride led him to make decisions without consulting God, and it ultimately cost him his kingdom. This is what pride does. You ready? Pride blinds leaders to their weaknesses. It makes them think they're above correction. And that's when they start making compromises. Small at first, but they get bigger and bigger until the whole thing collapses. And we've seen it time and time again. Here's something that will probably blow your mind. Your mouth's going to drop. 70% of pastors admit that they have no close friends. Think about that for a second. 70% of our pastors feel like they don't have close friends. These leaders are isolated. They're making decisions with no one holding them accountable. No one is speaking truth into their lives. And when you don't have anyone checking your ego, it grows out of control. Second chair leaders, this is where you come in. You need to be the voice of truth. You have a lot of responsibility. You carry a lot of weight. You need to be the one who's willing to say, hey, pastor, we need to talk about this. We need to check your heart on this. And it's not about tearing someone down. It's about keeping them from falling apart. And that's not easy, my friends. It's going to be uncomfortable. Extremely uncomfortable. It's going to feel awkward, very, very awkward. But let me tell you something out of experience. If you don't do it, who will? You can't let pride fester in your leadership team. We have to create like an environment where humility is valued over position. That means celebrating leaders who are willing to admit when they're wrong, who are open to correction, and who understand that their role is to serve, not to be served. So here are practical tips for combating pride. Number one, institute regular humility check-ins. Schedule one-on-one meetings where you can ask leaders to reflect on actions and reflect on their decisions. What will happen is these check-ins should focus on their motives. Why are we doing this? Is this God's glory or for God's glory, or is this for your own glory? And number two, encourage transparency. Make it a point to celebrate vulnerability. And you do this by share your own struggles and create a culture where leaders are encouraged to be open about their weaknesses. And that's hard, but it's important because what happens is this builds trust and breaks down all those religious walls of pride. Come on. Number three, as second chair leaders, model servant leadership. As a second chair leader, be the example of what it looks like to lead with humility. And I'm talking to myself today. Show that leadership is about serving others, not elevating yourself. So when your team sees you practicing what you preach, they'll be more likely to follow suit. All right, second chair leaders, we've already covered the dangers of unchecked pride and ego, but now we're going to dig into one of the most toxic threats to any leader, to all leaders, and it's isolation. You've heard it before. It's lonely at the top. And the truth is, too many church leaders are leading alone, disconnected from real relationships, real accountability, and real support. Let me tell you something. Isolation is the breeding ground for temptation. When a leader isolates themselves, they open the door to all kinds of dangerous influences. And if there's no one standing in the gap, moral failure is just around the corner. I mean, we all have to be mindful of this, myself included. Here's what happens right here. Leaders who isolate themselves get trapped in their own thoughts. They get trapped in their own head. They become blind to their weaknesses, convinced that they can handle everything on their own. And that's where the enemy strikes. That's the gap. That's where the enemy comes in. The Bible says in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. So let me just try to break that down for you. The enemy is looking for those who are alone, those who are isolated, because they're the easiest targets. If there's no one standing guard around your leader, the enemy will have a field day on your pastor, on your lead pastor, on your church. Let's not pretend this is just for an issue for mega church pastors or celebrity leaders. This is happening in churches of every size, small, big, whether it's a small town pastor, a youth leader, or a senior pastor of a mega church. Isolation is destroying ministries. And the moment a leader starts pulling away, that's when the alarm bells need to go off. And a second chair leader, you are the ones who should be sounding those alarms. Come on, ring those bells, because you see it too. You see it. You know what's going on. You're the closest person to your leader. You know what's happening. And let's look at the data. According to a study by Lifeway Research, 55% of pastors admit they feel lonely and isolated in their role. That's over half of our pastors. And let me tell you, that number is climbing every day. Leaders are more disconnected than ever before. Think about it. Think about it. Many pastors are spending hours preparing sermons. They're running meetings, managing the crazy day-to-day operations of the church and counseling people in crisis. The list goes on and on and on. But who is checking in on them? Who's checking in on your leader? Who's asking them how they're doing spiritually, emotionally, and relationally? I'm going to be real. I haven't got a call all week about how I'm doing. Not one person has asked us. I'm a pastor. The sad truth is many leaders feel like they have no one they can turn to. Who are we supposed to turn to? Now, here's where it gets even more dangerous. Lifeway also found that 23% of pastors report struggling with some form of addiction. And now that could be, it could be pornography, alcohol, or something else. And guess what? Isolation is fueling those addictions. So when no one knows what's going on behind the scenes, those struggles stay hidden. They stay buried and they grow in the dark shadows. And I'm telling you, if there's no accountability, there's no way to stop that train from derailing. And so the question is, why is this so dangerous? So let's break it down. Let's break it down even a bit further here. There's a psychological aspect to isolation that we absolutely cannot ignore, church leaders. When leaders isolate themselves, they lose perspective. The walls close in and their world shrinks. They start thinking that no one else understands what they're going through. And I've heard that time and time again. They convince themselves that they're the only ones who can handle the weight of leadership and handle the weight of ministry. And that's when pride, that's when fear, that's when self-deception kicks in. Dr. Henry Cloud, who is a well-known Christian psychologist, talks about this in his book, Boundaries for Leaders. He says that isolated leaders often develop a Messiah complex where they believe that everything depends on them. They feel the pressure to perform, to meet everyone's expectations, but they're afraid to admit when they're struggling. And because they don't feel like they can share their weaknesses, they hide them. I've been there. I know exactly what I'm talking about. This was me. And what happens when you hide your weaknesses? What do? They grow. They grow. Temptation takes root. Poor decisions become patterns. And before long, moral failure is inevitable. The Bible is full of warnings about the dangers of isolation. Proverbs 18:1 says, "Whoever isolates himself seeks his own desires. He breaks out against all sound judgment." Do you see that? Isolation leads to bad decision. It cuts you off from wisdom. It cuts you off from counsel, and it will cut you off from accountability. And that's exactly where the enemy wants you. I've said it before on this show. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, 9 through 10 gives us a clear picture of why we need each other. Why we need each other. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Let me ask you, second chair leaders, who's going to help your pastor up when and if they fall? If your pastor is isolated, who's going to be there to catch them before they hit the ground? I think it's your responsibility to stand in that gap today, to stand in that gap and make sure your pastor doesn't fall. Your pastor's not left alone, and your pastor can lean on you when they're weak. So, How do we break the cycle? How do we keep our leaders from drifting into isolation and setting themselves up for failure? Here's where second chair leaders play a very crucial role. Remember, you're not just there to assist with logistics or manage operations, although you will. You're there to be the lifeline for your senior pastor. You have the unique position of being close enough to see the cracks before they become full-blown failures. And here's what you need to do. Here are some practical strategies for breaking isolation. Number one, intentional check-ins. You check in with your pastor. Set up regular, intentional check-ins with your senior pastor. Not about the stinking church, but about them. Ask them the hard questions. Questions like, hey, pastor, how are you doing spiritually? What's been weighing on your heart lately? Share maybe what are your struggles? And these aren't casual conversations, guys. You need to dig deep and give them a safe space to open up. Practical tip number 2, encourage external mentorship. Every leader needs someone who is outside of the church who can offer perspective. That has been my greatest success. Encourage your pastors to seek out a mentor or spiritual advisor from outside the congregation, someone who can challenge them, somebody who can hold them accountable, somebody who can offer unbiased wisdom. Practical tip number 3, create a peer accountability group. Set up a network of peer leaders who can support each other like this right here. Pastors need other pastors to lean on, to share burdens with, and to hold them accountable. As a second chair leader, facilitate these relationships. Help them. Encourage your senior pastor to build a circle of trusted peers who can keep them grounded. And that is exactly what this is all about right here. Practical tip number 4, model vulnerability. One of the best ways to combat this isolation is by modeling vulnerability yourself. That means you need to be open about your own struggles, your own weaknesses, and your own need for support. When your senior pastor sees that you're willing to be vulnerable, it creates a culture where they feel safe to do the same. Practical tip number 5, set boundaries to prevent burnout. Burnout, oh my God, is often a major cause of isolation. When leaders are exhausted, which most of us are, they pull away from the people. That's what we do. So help your senior pastor set healthy boundaries around their work. Encourage them. Pastor, take time off. Go rest. I got you today. And to prioritize their own well-being. Hey, you been to the gym today? A leader who is constantly running on empty is far more likely to isolate themselves. This is huge right here. Community is the antidote to isolation. We were never, ever meant to walk this journey alone. As second chair leaders, you have the responsibility to ensure your senior pastor stays connected, whether, that's through those regular check-ins, maybe it's a peer accountability group like this one right here, or creating a safe space for vulnerability. You need to be ever so intentional about breaking through the walls of isolation. And remember, it's not just about preventing moral failure. It's about sustaining your leaders' spiritual and emotional health for the long haul. When a leader is connected, when a leader is accountable, and when a leader is supported, they can thrive. They have all the tools they need to thrive. So they can lead with integrity. They can lead with strength. And that's what your church needs today. All right, guys, second chair leaders, that's a wrap on episode number 5. We've covered so much today, some heavy topics. I hope you've enjoyed this today. Let me know in the comments if you've really liked this topic today. We've talked about pride. We've talked about isolation. And the truth is this, you have the power to prevent these downfalls. As a second chair leader, as a SCL, you're not just sitting back and you're just not just watching. You, my friend, you are the gatekeeper for your leader and your church, your organization. Your role is vital. And don't ever forget this. Second chair does not mean second best. You're in a position to protect the integrity of your ministry. Guys, do me a favor. Head over to my Instagram page right now. Hit like, hit some, friend me or whatever it is these days at Walker Tyler Official for more insights, encouragements, and daily tips on how to lead effectively from The Second Chair. And don't forget, if you would please go to Spotify or even Apple Podcasts and subscribe to the channel so you don't ever miss out on what is coming next. Y'all, if you got thoughts on today's show, if maybe this episode you want to go deeper, that's great. I want you to head over to the YouTube channel. Just search for Second Chair Leaders. I'm in the comments. I'm reading them. I'm probably going to respond to them. So let's keep this conversation going and moving forward. And listen, next week we're diving into episode number 6. I don't know which is the right way, where we're going to explore the ripple effects of leadership failures and how to rebuild trust when everything falls apart. It's a critical conversation for anyone serving in ministry. So don't miss it. Until next time, keep this in mind. I've said it once and I'll say it again. Second chair does not mean that you are second best. Listen to me. Your leadership matters more than you realize.